Now, before we jump into talking about the keyword this, I want to deal with callbacks. The reason for this is that we will be using callbacks as part of the discussion on the keyword this. Callbacks are used extensively throughout JavaScript, so it is very important to understand this pattern, even though initially it may be a bit tricky. If you haven't used callbacks in your own code, then most of your coding that you have done is executed all at once, sequentially, as the program runs. This is synchronous. However, there are many times when it is beneficial to have code executed after something else has happened, not sequential. We call this asynchronous. Callbacks allow us to achieve this and is necessary to solve many programming problems. Now, a callback is simply a function that is invoked or called after something else happens. So whether or not the function runs depends entirely on something else happening, not simply on the program running to completion. This is achieved in JavaScript by passing a function into another function, and then that function is called back, executed, after something else has occurred. This is possible because JavaScript supports higher order functions, which we'll talk about in a later section. Let's look at a couple examples to see how this works so you can understand it better. Now, the first example we're going to look at is a function that is called back after a certain amount of time using setTimeout. This allows us to do that sort of thing. setTimeout makes use of callbacks. Now, before I enter the example, I'm going to go ahead and pull up the console. This is what we'll be watching the results on, so I want to go ahead and pull it up. And now we'll jump to Visual Studio Code, and I'm just going to resize that so we can see the console while we're working here. So I mentioned we're going to use the setTimeout function first. So what I'm going to do is first set up a function, log call. That's what we're going to name it. And all this is going to do is to log to the console. This function was called back. We'll say called back, where the name comes from. All right, so there is our function. Now, in creating setTimeout, we simply use setTimeout. We pass in a function, which is log call. And then we pass in amount of time that we want it to wait in milliseconds. So we're going to enter 3000 to represent 3 seconds. Now, if we go ahead and save this, we wait 3 seconds, and then we get the function was called back. We go ahead and get that out of the console. So that's working for us. And this is a callback now. We've passed this function into this function, and it gets called back after 3 seconds. So it's a callback. Now, as you're most likely aware, a lot of functions are defined at the point we enter them as a callback. So with setTimeout, we could define the function right here. Instead of defining it before, as we've done up here, I can go ahead and comment that out, and then we can just define the function here. And it's an anonymous function because we have not assigned it a name, but we can get it to do the exact same thing. We get the same results even with this anonymous function. So if I save that, we wait 3 seconds, and this function was called back. Now, a very common application of callbacks in JavaScript, one that you see frequently, are event listeners. So you attach an event to something. When you're programming on the browser, you're attaching that event to an element in the HTML document. And when that event occurs, a function is called back. Thereby, you're able to do something in response to something that has happened, in response to that event. So what we're going to do on this HTML page, there is a logo down here, Learn Modern JavaScript. And if we look at that HTML page, it has an ID of JS logo. And so we're going to attach an event listener to that, just a click event, so that when we click that, it will display something. So let's go ahead and do that. First thing I want to do is set up a variable that contains that element or references that element. And so I'm going to use a common method for selecting an element that has an ID, get element by ID. And I'm going to pass in that ID, JS logo. Just like that. Now that we have that as a part of this variable, we can go ahead and add an event listener to it. And this is where we'll see the callback. So add event listener. This is the preferred method for responding to events in JavaScript, is using add event listener. And then here is our event, click. And now this is where we put the callback. And we can just define it here. So function, I'm going to go ahead and put a variable in there, e, that is for the event object that can be passed in. We're not going to use it, but I'm just going to do that out of habit. And then we'll just log to the console something here. Let's just log the logo was clicked, something like that. So now we'll save this. Now this code right here, this function, will not be invoked unless someone clicks on that logo. And so it's not called, this callback is not called until someone clicks on it. So it's not sequential. It's asynchronous. Let's go ahead and give it a try. So if we look at the console, we're seeing that the initial set timeout has already fired. Now if I go down to the logo here and click on it, the logo is clicked. And we're seeing that that function is then called at the time we click it. So that is an introduction to the callback pattern. That's to help understand the callback pattern. Now, the same pattern can be used in your own code. You may set up callbacks in functions that you create, and it can be powerful. And that's what I want to look at next. So let's move on.